So last night, I watched a documentary that was screened by AARP. You don't have to be a member to watch these documentaries. They are open to pretty much anyone who registers. And I'm not the hugest fan of documentaries. I mean, if the subject matter is of interest to me, I will definitely check them out. But it's not something I'm typically drawn to. However, the premise for this documentary was just fascinating to think about. I have seen this particular scenario played out in different, or at least one different movie that I've seen, fictional movie. Maybe it had some elements of truth woven in, but the concept, well, it's not a concept. This is something that really happened. This is a story about a female prisoner of Auschwitz. Her name was Helena, and her love affair or her connection with an SS officer that was there. And I think his name was, Franz. I might be misremembering, but I think his name was Franz. Her name was Helena. And I don't know why I just was like, I would like to watch this. It's just so, I don't know. It's just kind of, in some ways it's hard to wrap your brain around a situation like this, but then at the same time, not really, because situations were so horrific and people were put in a position where they would do anything they had to do to survive, including things like turning on their fellow man, turning in their fellow man to try to save themselves, stuff like that. There was a situation that they talked about in there, and it was very, very briefly, but it just kind of underscored to me the things that people do to survive, and how in so many ways those things are horrific. And you can hardly just imagine someone doing something like that. And yet, because we are geared towards survival, a lot of times we do awful things when a fear factor sets in. I mean, we've seen that sort of stuff happening even just recently with regard to the whole thing with, the pandemic and all of that. Awful things that people are doing and saying to each other because their fear has let them control their sense of logic and reason. And in a lot of ways, it parallels the type of behavior that went on, because humans are what they are. But anyway, getting back to this documentary, the main thing that I had a big issue with about this documentary was the subtitles. The subtitles were small and they were white. And when there was a light background, which often there was because there was a lot of black and white imagery that was shown, you couldn't read it very well. And I spent most of my time focused on the stinking subtitles. I was not, because they were so small, I missed a lot of the facial expressions that the people being interviewed were having. And that to me was a big negative. However, I still think it's worth checking it out if you're even remotely interested in something like this. I'm not, like I said, I'm not necessarily always, stuff about the Holocaust, World War II, the concentration camps, it's freaking depressing. And it's so painful to think about. It's like, I just can't, it's just so hard to imagine the things that have been done in wartime, not just to people who are involved in the war, but people who were caught up in the whole mess of that. Anyway, the main thing that I took away from this, and it made my head and my heart hurt to think about it, because it was just the waters were very muddied. It just drove home to me how nuanced people are. Most of the time, people are not just black or white. There are so many shades of gray involved in people. And it blows my mind, the story of these two. So she's in this terrible situation. She meets this SS officer who works there at the camp. Now, from what I understand, He never murdered anybody. He did beat people. He never murdered people. He wasn't directly involved in gathering people together to send them to the gas chambers and stuff like that. There was a trial that he did face in the early 70s. I mean, this is all stuff you can look up, if you want to just find out anything about it. But she meets this guy. I think their first meeting had something to do with her singing a song. She was singing a song, and the SS officers were there or something, and so she comes in contact with him. And when she interacted with him the first time, there was a comment that she made, because they interviewed her in her later years as well. They interviewed him in his later years. They interviewed her sister in her later years. They also interviewed, well, obviously in their later years, right? Then they also interviewed people that were in the prison with her, her friends, and other people that were just there and knew the situation. But Helena said, this is kind of paraphrasing, but this is in general what she mentioned. She was talking about how when she looked at him, interacted with him the first time they spoke or whatever, and he asked her if she knew German or something like that. And she made a comment about, when she looked at him, she was thinking, where are the eyes of a murderer? These are the eyes of a human being. And so they formed this relationship. And obviously, I think most people, and probably Helena herself, would feel like it was because of her situation. It was, he's befriending her. He's being nice to her. She wants to survive. So what choice does she have, right? I mean, she has no choice in the matter. I got the feeling based on the documentary, though, that he never forced himself on her as far as that goes. Now, you could still say, yes, he was forcing himself on her because of the situation. And I completely get that. And maybe she, what's that? It's called Stockholm Syndrome. This is not exactly that, but how maybe prisoners might form an attachment to their guards and feel like they have, emotions for them and stuff like that. This is definitely something that was probably a factor for sure. But the way the story was told, I mean, it's so crazy. It's like it comes off as this star-crossed lover type of situation. I mean, it's like if they had met in another lifetime, in another situation, they probably would have they would have been together and lived happily ever after and stuff like that. But anyway, it's just crazy. It's so crazy. Like, he would do things. He was nice to her. He would protect her. He would protect her friends. And by extension, even people that were resentful of the relationship that she had with him, because, she got perks because she was with this guy, she would be harassed by people that were jealous. And she knew that if she told on them, that they would be killed. So she still had this sense of protection, even, for her fellow prisoners and those who were mistreating her, because she didn't want anything to happen to them. So by extension, they were protected by her as well. Y'all, it was like, I can't even hardly put it into words how weird this was to think about. It's just like, wow, this is just, you're watching these people and the horrible stuff they went through and the horrible stuff they did, in the case of this guy. It's just, you think to yourself, how fascinating it is that the human mind is so efficient with compartmentalization, especially in the case of the guy, Franz. They were saying how he would be brutal with the men. He never mistreated the women. He never beat them. He was never cruel to them, but he would be brutal, and sometimes he would beat the men. And there would be times where she would either see it happening or know it was happening, and she would intervene and grab his hand, and he would stop and he would calm down. And then on the flip side, there would be moments where she was having these, panic attacks because, the situation that she's in, her part of her family has been killed. She's in a concentration camp. Her sister ends up coming to the concentration camp as well. And there's a whole dramatic story about what happened with her sister that I don't want to delve into that too much, because honestly, this documentary, I swear to goodness, this is like a movie. This is like a suspense type of movie. Even the stuff that happened to them after they got out of the camp, running for their lives, the stuff that happened to them even then, it's just a miracle that they're alive, that they made it. They're not alive anymore. They passed a few years ago, but it's a miracle that they survived. But what I was saying is, what the heck was I saying? Oh, she would be having these panic attacks. And he would come to her and he would calm her down. And his presence helped calm her down. And it was just... you can see I'm just like... I wanted to film this right after I finished watching it, but I had to get right back to work, so I couldn't. But I don't feel I have my thoughts any more together now than I did last night, because it was just such an eerie feeling to be watching this thing. I felt like that, well, you get the sense about the guy. After the war, he still had a thing for her. He wanted to be with her. He tried to contact her. He would do things like, I think his daughter said he would do things like, he had pictures of her, and he would cut like the head of her. And he, as you can see here, what's going on, put her head on either another person's body or whatever, like in a totally different situation, like in that one, they're at the beach. It's like he's imagining in his mind what their life could have been like if it weren't for the situation that they were both in. And you could criticize this man for even being part of what he was part of. But as you sort of realize about people caught up in that sort of situation, a lot of times they're in it without any sort of real control, like any sort of choice, especially if they want to survive. But the SS officers, the SS, they were like the worst of the worst. But it's just, their story is just, I just can't. Like when the war was over and he was trying to contact her, she, at that point, she even made a comment that the last time they saw each other, when the camp was, the camp was about to fall, or the camp was about to be overrun, or taken over by the Allied forces, and so the prisoners were let loose, or they just had to run, or whatever, and their final words to each other, their final moments, and he made some sort of comment to her about, hoping that they could get together after this was all done, or something like that. And then she made a comment too about how she had real emotion for him at that point. And of course, time, distance separates them. The war's over. She moves on with her life. She marries. She has a family. He still wanted to strike up things with her, but when someone in her family wrote him back and was basically like, leave her alone. And so then as the more time separated them, I feel like she started to have so many issues of self-hate and disgust and just so much trauma in her head because of what she'd lived through and also what she had experienced with this man. Her children would talk about, or I think it was at least one of her children talked about how she would have these fits, these hysterical fits of violence, like not necessarily against them, but things like throwing stuff around, breaking dishes, just screaming and just going nuts. And it feels to me like she probably at some point had this sort of breakdown in her mind, because there's only so much that the human mind can go through, or that a human can endure before at some point there's like this mental break that happens with them. And certainly the stuff that she lived through was horrific, absolutely terrible. And they talked about the crematoriums and how the sky would be blood red, I guess because of all the smoke, and the people that were coming to the camp, and how they had the suitcases and there were the shoes. They showed images of that, and it's just so terrible. I mean, honestly, there are just not words enough to express how absolutely awful that time in history was. And on top of all that, when he has his trial, his wife contacts this woman, asks if she will come and give testimony. She came and gave testimony. They had no interaction with each other. She wouldn't even look at him in the trial. But what she must have gone through to relive that. And when she went and she gave her testimony, she was fair. She told the truth. She did not make up exaggerations about how she had been treated by him. And so because of her relationship with him, there was a great deal of pressure on her by people who knew her situation, by her country, by her government. She received threats and things like that. She was harassed by her own people. And I just felt really sorry for her, the situation that must have been, and the relationship between her and one of her sisters, the one who came to the camp. That story is just heartbreaking, you guys. It's so, that's part of the story that I don't want to tell too much of, because I really feel like this is certainly worth watching on your own. So I don't want to give any spoilers. I mean, that sounds so lame to say as spoilers for a true life sort of documentary thing. These are things you could find out yourself if you wanted to look it up. But just because of the complex swirl of emotions this documentary generated in me, I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to share it with you if you hadn't ever heard of it. I never even mentioned the name of the dang documentary. As you can see, it's Love It Was Not. I feel like it's worth the watch. It's not terribly long. It's only about an hour and a half, and it's just amazing. It's just astounding, the story of these two people, especially her. And the weird, it was like this weird mixture of disgust and sympathy. Not really disgust with her, but disgust with, the situation she was in, him, but yet at the same time, there was a lot of nuance with him. And it was hard to outright hate this man. That's obviously the situation she was in. She didn't hate him. She would talk with him about how, I think she said something like, she mentioned about how that he was hurting her brothers and sisters. And by that, she just meant figuratively speaking, her people. And it was like a part of her, I think she just had a hard time separating her experience or she had a hard time reconciling the experience that she went through with him, because he was nice to her. He didn't mistreat her. And yet also she knew what he was part of. And she couldn't reconcile these things in her brain. And who could really? I mean, really, who could? And it was just a weird mix of thoughts I had, you guys. Not weird, but it was just like I couldn't reconcile it myself. Except to just feel tremendously sorry for her and her situation, and sorry to an extent for him too. It put me in a really sad funk just thinking again about the atrocity of warfare, what it does to people who are directly involved with it, like let's say soldiers. He had mentioned how he never wanted to be someone who was sent to the camps. He wanted to be on the front line. He wanted to be fighting. A lot of people who fight in wars, they're not necessarily there because they want to be there. They're there because they do feel it's like a sense of duty. Sometimes they don't even fully understand what is being fought, what is being fought about. They're just there because it's ingrained into them. You do this thing. This is your country. You have to fight for your country. This kind of reminds me quite a bit of the messaging in The Kingsman, which I've mentioned. It's an anti-war film. That's the fundamental theme of that movie. And it touches on that, basically the lie that is to tell people that it's an honor and to die for your country or something like that. And obviously that's, that can be certainly argued that's a matter of opinion. Some people do feel that that's something that's worthy and honorable. And there are other people who feel like in no way ever is it okay. And then there's people kind of in between that where they're torn because they get why people feel this sense of duty to fight for your country. And yet they're tormented by how senseless and meaningless all of this seems to be. And when we think about things like war and killing and bad people in war, it's very easy for us to just kind of paint this very clear image in our brain, good guys, bad guys. And yet we often forget that underneath all of that, there are individuals, and individuals have their own stories. And not everybody's stories is clear cut and, like I said, black and white. And it's just, it's hard to kind of come to grips with that. Because you want, like a lot of times the human mind wants this easy thing to settle on. This is the way it is, period. And sometimes there are things that are like that. But so much about life in general and people in general is not like that. As horrific as the things that they're involved in can be, there are all these different shades to people that can, when you hear their story, a lot of times it makes it harder to outright condemn or outright hate them as an individual. You can hate what they were involved in, but them as an individual. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly or in a way that you guys know what I'm trying to say, but it's just, this movie blew my mind. This documentary blew my mind, and it certainly triggered some uncomfortable thoughts and feelings because, like a lot of people, I want things to be clear-cut. I understand that completely, that it's not that way, but it certainly does help the mind rest a little better. And at the same time, you know that that's not the case. But it just, I don't know, it's just, I don't have adequate words. I really don't. But this was a pretty impactful documentary. I'll never forget it for sure. And I wish they would make a movie about this. And I wish they would, well, in a sense they did with the documentary, but I wish they would be able to do it justice in a way that presents both of these individuals as human beings and the terrible situation that surrounded them and how complicated it all was. And I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it. It's terribly sad. It was really, really sad. Especially the story of her sister, which, like I said, I won't get into, but well, I have meandered and meandered. This was terrible. This is like one of the worst reviews ever. I even had little notes, but I was looking through the notes, but I'm just like, everything was just a jumble. So I think I'm going to shut up at this point wrap things up here. And I highly recommend this if you guys feel like you have the stomach to watch something that's so thought-provoking and uncomfortable. In other words, because I did not expect to come away from this with the thoughts and sentiments that I did. And I maybe that was the whole point of it, to make you think about stuff and the complexities of people and their lives and their stories and everything. So anyway, okay, I guess that's it for now. Yeah, that's certainly it for now. Wow. Editing this, I'm gonna have to take out a lot of long pauses as I thought about the proper and easily understandable way to say things. But okay, yeah, I'm definitely stopping now, you guys. Later.